Welcome to Love Factually, the podcast that analyzes rom-coms and romantic films using the science of close relationships. We're your hosts, Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel. We have a very special guest joining us shortly, but first, Eli, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about Easy A, the 2010 teen movie that serves as a rom-com Easter egg hunt and a star-making vehicle for a rising phenom known as Emma Stone. Some of the themes we'll explore are the lingering sexual double standard, the nature of sex positivity, and the assumptions people make about self-esteem and casual sex.
And fair warning, we'll be spoiling this movie today. So if you don't know how to spend a wonderful weekend alone with just your dog and a greeting card that plays Pocket Full of Sunshine, then go ahead and watch this movie and come back. Okay, Eli, who are the key characters and couples in this movie?
The core of Easy A is Olive Pendergast, a student at Ojai North High School, played by Emma Stone in a Golden Globe-nominated performance. She is wry, witty, and kind. She tells her best friend a white lie, falsely claiming that she'd lost her virginity to a random college guy, and this story takes on a life of its own. That friend is Rhiannon, who more or less entraps Olive into telling the lie and then abandons her once the lie conquers Olive's reputation. Brandon is the first of several boys who seek to bolster their own reputations by paying Olive to pretend she's had sex with them. Marianne is a religious zealot who spearheads a self-serving morality campaign against Olive. Her boyfriend Micah is hiding a scandalous secret. Last but not least is Olive's longtime crush, Todd, who works as the school's mascot and is known affectionately as Woodchuck Todd. So, Paul, those are the chess pieces. Are you ready to give us 1 minute on how the film moves them across the board?
Let's do this.
All
Count
right,
me
man.
down.
On your mark. Get set. Go.
Olive Pendergast spends a weekend by herself, but then lies to her best friend Ree that she actually spent the weekend losing her virginity. Marianne overhears the conversation, and the rumor quickly spreads across school. Instead of denying it, Olive embraces her new bad girl image, inspired by Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, even sewing a red A on her wardrobe. Soon, boys start asking Olive to fake hookups with them. They give her gift cards, and the rumors make them seem straight in the case of her friend Brandon, or boost their sexual credentials. She even lies about giving Micah chlamydia so that his lover, Mrs. Griffith, doesn't have to admit her affair with him. However, as the lies pile up, Olive's friendships suffer, and the Cross Your Heart religious group starts protesting her existence. All this time, she's been reconnecting with former crush Todd, who seems nonplussed by her fake transformation. As she performs a musical number in front of the school reminiscent of Ferris Bueller, then live streams a confession where she admits the lies while also calling out the hypocrisy of her classmates, and then Todd shows up to whisk her away in a mashup of Say Anything, The Breakfast Club, and Can't Buy Me Love.
Nice, like 57 seconds, and a true mashup of basically the Love Factually greatest hits.
I know, seriously. But we are very fortunate today because we have with us on the podcast the host of the Sex and Psychology podcast, Justin Lehmiller. Justin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey guys, I'm so happy to be here.
So tell us, Justin, what is your relationship to this movie?
So it's a movie that I actually only ever saw once before when it first came out. And I just remembered it distinctly having an interesting message about adolescent, teenage sexuality. And I thought it would be interesting to revisit it today because so much has changed when it comes to young people and their sex lives and their relationships and how virginity is perceived differently today than it was in the past. So I thought it could be a cool way to kind of revisit just kind of how some of these broader trends have changed, not just in media representation, but also in people's actual everyday lives.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's interesting where this movie sits time-wise, right? Because it's coming after a lot of the, whole slew of teen comedies that were, in the decade and 2 decades before. But it's old enough now that, some things in here don't feel quite as contemporary. But Eli, what about you? What's your relationship to this movie?
One thing that I found fun watching it, and this is the first time I've ever seen it, is, there's that part where Olive says, for the first time ever, my sexual exploits were the talk of the school. And then she's like, wait, sorry, I'm wrong. And she talks about how she did 7 minutes in heaven with Todd when they were in 8th grade. And what it reminded me about is that we have used this as a research paradigm. Paul, I think you know this at least.
Oh, yeah, you did.
We used it. And actually,
God,
just for the fun of it, I'm gonna read the instructions. So imagine, dear listener, that you and your partner were there in our social psychology relationship science lab. And these were the instructions. For the next 7 minutes, we will leave the two of you alone in this room and would like you to engage in some form of physical intimacy. You can engage in as little or as much physical intimacy as you'd like within reason, and it can be as simple as holding hands or can involve kissing and making out. It's whatever you'd like to do. When the 7 minutes are up, we'll knock and give you a moment before entering the room.
Did anybody hold hands for 7 minutes?
I don't think we had any 7-minute hand holders, but we had some passionate moments in there.
That's wild. So let's talk about what this movie gets right about the nature of attraction and close relationships. Why don't I toss it to you, Justin? What things struck you in here that seemed, to be characterizing the experiences correctly?
Well, so first, and I think most obviously, is that this is a movie about the sexual double standard. The idea that women are judged more harshly than men for their sexual behavior and their sexual desires and so forth. And we see that coming up a lot throughout this movie, where Olive is repeatedly shamed by all of her classmates for being sexual, or for them perceiving her as being sexual, right? She wasn't having sex with all of these people, right? But it was just the idea that they thought she was having sex with all these boys was enough for them to really make her this social outcast. Yeah. And, historically, we have lots of data showing that there's been a sexual double standard, that women are judged more harshly than men. But that's something that has changed to some extent in recent years, right? So in newer studies, we see that the sexual double standard is lessening, and in some cases that it's reversed depending on, what specific study you're talking about and looking at. But yeah, I mean, it is still timely, this idea that we have these kind of double standards out there. And, something else that I thought was really interesting about this movie is just sort of the way that they talk about virginity. And historically, there's been this big emphasis on virginity as something that people place this high value on, and you're considered more desirable if you've had less sexual experience. Right. But that is something else that has also changed and shifted in recent years. My colleague at the Kinsey Institute, Amanda Gesselman, conducted a study a few years ago that basically showed that virginity has kind of gone out of fashion, and that virginity is now like a stigmatized social status for men and women alike. And that when people are rating the sexual desirability of other people, that there's actually this virgin penalty, right? And if you don't have sexual experience, you're considered to be less desirable than somebody who does have sexual experience. And even people who are virgins themselves don't want to have sex with other virgins, right? So it's become this really stigmatized status. And, we could talk about how that also connects to like the modern rise of incel culture. And like, I think there's so many things that are relevant here.
You could imagine it, right? It's not crazy. If I was trying to think of like what would make a good like tennis partner or something, it might be somebody who had some experience with tennis.
Right.
But people want partners who are experienced but not too experienced, right? So there's also other research where they've looked at kind of like what's the ideal number of partners for someone to have, and in that research what they found was that for people between like up to 8 partners is sort of like where the sweet spot is, and more than 8 partners, desirability starts to come down after there. So it's like, I want you to be experienced, but not too experienced, right? Because I think people sometimes perceive it as a threat in some way, or there's an insecurity about it when somebody has a lot more sexual experience than they do.
One of the things about the sexual double standard that I thought the movie captured very well is the sort of public slut shaming that happens to women in particular. And so this is a study that I came across doing research for this episode that I thought was very clarifying vis-a-vis what we see in the movie. It's a study by Carrie Pickle. And the idea in this study is they have an incident where this girl is being bullied. And in some cases, she's, just sort of portrayed as an average teenager. But then in another condition, they add on top of it that she really enjoys casual sex. Okay, so that's the experimental manipulation here. And everyday people are less willing to punish the bully. They punish the bully less harshly when she enjoys casual sex than when she doesn't. Right? So the bully's behavior seems somehow more justifiable when she is given this characterization. And so I thought that was a particularly clear demonstration of the way that people sometimes judge women for these kinds of things. And we're kind of seeing things like that in this movie. Other things that this movie gets right. Eli, what about you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things in there that I find interesting. So one of the themes that we talk about a lot on this podcast is this idea of a microculture. That is, that the two of us over time build up our own little unique culture. And then the more we lean into that unique culture, the better we are in the relationship. And I bring this up in part because Olive and Todd kind of develop this cute microculture throughout the movie. So early on, there's that party where Olive has just pretended to have sex with Brandon so that he can convince everybody he's in fact not gay, which of course he in fact is. But after that, Todd, the guy that Olive actually has a crush on, shows up and he says,
"How's it going?"
I'm here.
Can I get you a beer?
That rhymed. I liked it.
And what I think is fun about that is the very last scene when she's doing the last part of her podcast and he rides up on the lawnmower.
I see you've been watching my live webcast. Still going on,
Screw them. They've had enough of you. Figuratively speaking. I borrowed my neighbor's mower. I came right over.
That almost rhymed.
I know. I spent a minute on it.
I'll be right down.
And I think it's a great illustration of how we can develop these styles of interacting together. For the two of them, it's sort of like bad, playful rhyming, and it's something that brings them closer to each other.
Yeah, and it doesn't take all that many interactions.
No, or even really the ability to rhyme.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Other things that this movie gets right about attraction and close relationships. Justin, do you have any others?
Well, so this is a very small point, but there is a scene where Olive is at the lobster shack with one of the guys who wants to pay her to pretend that she's had sex with him. And there's this brief little comment about how she says, aphrodisiacs like oysters and so forth don't actually work. And I'm like, that actually is true, right? So we have data showing that most of the things that people think of as being aphrodisiacs don't actually create sexual desire or arousal. And even though they might contain chemicals that could help to play a role in arousal, it's just that you have to eat them in such a large quantity that no one would ever actually consume them in the amount that would actually trigger an aphrodisiac-like effect.
That's really funny.
Yeah, so, lots of rhinoceros horns.
Right.
Yeah. So is it like somebody at one point did consume enough oysters to get the boost out of it and was like, is this happening?
It's real.
Or no, people just made this up? I mean, do you have any idea what the origin of this thing is?
Well, I think a lot of it when it comes to aphrodisiac is just placebo effects, right? And so it's where somebody at some point along the way probably ate oysters and then felt really horny afterwards, and then they told their friends that, hey, if you want to have this sexual prowess in the bedroom, eat some oysters first. And so it sort of starts this rumor, and then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where people expected it to affect them in a certain way, and it did. So, the actual biological mechanism of aphrodisiacs, not a lot of support for that, but you can certainly lead yourself to believe that it's going to have an effect, and through a self-fulfilling prophecy, it will.
Right. It can be very powerful. One other thing that I appreciated, and I think this is a scene we're probably going to talk about more than once on this podcast, but I'd like to talk about the scene when Olive and her mother are on top of the car, and her mother is talking about her own sexual history.
I had a similar situation when I was your age.
What? Everyone called you a slut?
I had a horrible reputation, and people said awful things about me.
Why?
Because I was a slut. I slept with a whole bunch of people, a slew, a heap, a peck, mostly guys.
Mom!
Sorry, I got around. Before I met Dad, I had incredibly low self-worth.
Do me a favor and just stuff this down my throat until I asphyxiate to death? To die.
It's true.
I want to die.
It's true. Oh. It's true. I was quite the contortionist. I could do this thing. I could go. I mean, my life.
Stop. Can you stop? Don't show me. Can you not see that I'm a mess?
No, you're not, Olive. You're wonderful. And you'll handle this the same way I did, with an incontrovertible sense of humor. But you're much smarter than I am. So you'll come out of this much better than I did.
Thank you.
I could get my legs so...
No.
And one message that you can take from that scene that I think is pretty much spot on and that I also appreciated is the idea that your sexual history kind of has nothing to do with your later relationship status, your later satisfaction in your marriage. And like, this is kind of a thing that's out there. You know, sometimes, you know, people talk about like body count. Oh, if you have like a high body count, you know, if you had a lot of sex partners, oh, you're not going to be able to have a fulfilling relationship later. It's pretty much nonsense. These effects that are out there, I mean, even if you look at the studies that claim to support this, these effects are very, very small. Sometimes they're larger than 0, but they're pretty tiny on the whole. Things like number of prior sex partners and marital satisfaction, things like number of prior sex partners and likelihood of divorce. These effects are all pretty small, generally speaking. So I liked this idea that her mother could be like, yeah, I had a lot of sex partners and like I met your father and like life's good. Mm-hmm. And I thought that is how most people will experience that.
It's very true. And, you know, I hate that term body count, but I use it sometimes just because people understand what it means.
Right.
But yeah, it does not define you as a person. And the only time it really becomes an issue in relationships is when somebody feels insecure about somebody else's body count.
Yeah,
and
right.
when people start getting into that comparison of, well, how many partners have you had? And then it turns into a whole thing. And we've seen that fight play out so many times in the popular media. Like there's, you know, an episode of Will and Grace, for example, where Grace and her boyfriend at the time, Nathan, you know, kind of have that comparison of how many partners they had. And then it leads to this huge fight, right? Yeah. Because one person has had way more partners than the other. And so, yeah, it matters in those popular media discussions, and it matters when somebody feels insecure about it. But the reality is, whether you have many partners or few partners, you can be happy, healthy, satisfied in your relationships.
Well, let's talk about some misconceptions about attraction and relationships in this movie. Why don't I toss it to you, Eli? Why don't you start us off here? Any misconceptions that you noticed?
Okay. I had some reservations about that scene we played earlier between Olive and her mom, in large part because it clearly seems to imply, despite this being a movie that's supposed to be, you know, basically on Olive's side, a redo of the Scarlet Letter, it sounds like a pretty critical way of thinking about a woman who might want to have casual sex. I was
the low self-worth comment in particular.
Yes,
when her mother says that, yeah.
Exactly. I was a slut. Mom, what are you talking about? I got around. I had low self-worth. And that seems to imply that, like, what should we make of a woman who sleeps around? Well, she has low self-worth. And so it turns out that there's some really good research on this from Jamie Arona-Krems. And what she finds is that this is a widespread stereotype, that women, but not men, who have lots of sex partners are doing it in part because they have low self-esteem, because they don't value themselves. Look, we can look not only at whether there is a stereotype along these lines, but whether the stereotype is in fact true. And the basic result from a 6-study package of research is no. There is basically no meaningful association between how many people a woman has slept with and what her sense of self-worth is. And the stereotype is so sticky, people are so convinced about it, that even in a study where the researchers tell the participants this woman had casual sex because she wanted to, because it was something that she enjoyed doing and she was doing it for her own reasons, they still can't shake the belief that, but really it's about them having low self-worth. And so I didn't like this moment in the film when the mother seems to imply that, like, well, why did I sleep with a lot of people? Because I had low self-esteem.
And, you know, I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the sexual double standard and how how women are just judged and evaluated differently for their sexual behaviors. And, there's long been this idea that women shouldn't have or shouldn't want to have casual sex, and that if they do, there must be something wrong with them, right? And so this is a good demonstration of how that idea has been embedded in popular culture. And I think we've seen that come up in a lot of other examples of film and television and so forth. But is it true in reality? No. And, that gets to a lot of the other research that's out there on casual sex, which finds that, what are the outcomes of casual sex? Like, you hear from a lot of people that casual sex is always bad and people regret it and it's damaging for your mental health and well-being. And then you have other people who say it's positive and healthy. And, the truth is that it's like everything else, a mixed bag. There are people who have positive experiences with it, people who have negative experiences with it. So the idea that a woman would only have casual sex because she has low self-worth just is not substantiated.
No.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask both of you a question. So honestly, the first time I watched this scene, I missed it. I missed the mother saying that phrase because I had low self-worth, right? I just, I had to go back to see that it was there. And so I actually came away with very much, if not the opposite message, but just it felt like a far more normalizing message to me that her mother was like, yeah, like I did, it was fine. It was like no big deal. And I'm curious. I think I know where you landed, Eli. But Justin, I'm curious, like how you ended up feeling about this scene in particular, and that comment. Did it really color the scene for you, like it did for Eli, or did you kind of miss it, like me?
I think everybody takes a little something different away from this. And for me, what I focused more on in that scene was just sort of the nature of the relationship between Olive and her mother, and more broadly, the relationship she has with her parents and how that's depicted throughout the film. And they're sort of portrayed as being kind of perfect parents, and they seem to be very sex positive and very open in terms of talking about sex and sexuality with their kids. But to me, what I took away was that that's actually very unrealistic. Most parents don't do that, right?
Right.
When we look at data and research on like how comfortable are parents talking to their kids about sex, like very uncomfortable with it, right?
Yeah.
Most parents recognize that it's important to do this, and yet they don't initiate the conversations because it feels awkward, uncomfortable, or embarrassing for them. So, a more realistic portrayal of the relationship between a parent and their kid would be for there to be some kind of awkwardness and tension around how these things are discussed or disclosed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Other things about what this movie maybe misses about attraction and close relationships. Justin, do you have anything?
Well, so something that came up for me several times throughout the movie was I was thinking about sexual consent, right? And I think consent is always an interesting thing to look at in film and television. And toward the end of the film, there's actually this set of scenes that are back to back that I think go about demonstrating like the wrong way to navigate consent and then the right way to do it.
Interesting.
So there's a sexual assault scene kind of following the lobster shack visit, right?
Right.
Where the guy that Olive is with, sorry, I'm terrible with names of characters, but the guy that she's with at that point forces a kiss on her, which she rebuffs, right? And, there was no asking whether it was okay for them to kiss or anything like that. And then sort of immediately following that, when she gets in the car with the other guy, again, terrible with names, sorry.
That's Todd.
That's with Todd, right?
Yeah,
with
Judge Todd.
With Penn Badgley, right? I remember the actors.
Right, exactly.
I have a hard time with the character names. But, they get to talking, and then he asks her, can I kiss you, right? And so you have that good demonstration of affirmative consent following a scene of non-consent. So, that's one of the things that, I like about the movie is that there is a scene that kind of shows how consent should work.
I also noticed his behavior in response to that. And by the way, one thing I appreciated about the film is the lobster guy's behavior was clearly wildly inappropriate, and everybody watching the scene knows it, and Olive is distressed about it. And I don't know why Woodchuck Todd just happened to be driving by there at that moment. But anyway,
he works there. He works at the shack.
He does work there. It was sort of convincient timing, I guess, that he got off at work at that moment. I'm happy to grant it. No worries for me about the movie. But I appreciated, just briefly, I know we're sort of, this is a little bit back to what I think the movie gets right, is, he could see she's distressed, and he says, Olive, let me drive you home. And they get in her car, in his car rather, and she's sobbing. She's clearly upset. And what does he say? He says, do you want to talk about it? And I love that. That's just such a great way to try to engage. Not like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Tell me what's wrong. But like, are you ready yet? Are you inclined to talk about it? And again, in our field, we talk a lot about responsiveness, right? And the way to be responsive, according to Harry Reese and others, is being understanding, validating, and caring. And just in those like few seconds of screen time, we see Woodchuck Todd really nailing it, being responsive. And in fact, she does open up to him.
Since we talked a little bit about consent, there is something else that came up during the film, and this is one of the things that made me uncomfortable about it, was the depiction of student-teacher relationships, right? And, we've seen a lot of other movies where you've had student-teacher relationships, like, for example, in the movie Mean Girls, like there's a student-teacher relationship there, but this one's a little bit different because it's a female teacher with a male student, so it's a little bit subversive in that it's a version that we don't see very often, but it wasn't treated as a sexual assault like it would be if the gender roles were reversed, right? People see things very differently when it's a male teacher and a female student compared to a female teacher and a male student. People are more likely to describe, a female student with a male teacher that she would be a victim, that this would be sexual harassment, sexual assault, versus with a male student and a female teacher, people will say, oh, he's lucky, right? And they don't treat it the same way. And you see that, in terms of how these cases are actually handled in the real world, where, female perpetrators of sexual violence often get lesser sentences than male perpetrators do, because, people kind of don't want to believe that women can be perpetrators of sexual assault, right? And so, I found it uncomfortable in this movie, the way that it was just kind of trivialized how this teacher was having a relationship with a student when, that's clearly wrong.
Yeah, and also she kind of depicts it like, oh, he was showering her with attention, like he was making the moves on her. Right. I mean, again, like that's the narrative of the story, but it conveniently avoids that exact issue that you're describing.
For those who haven't seen the movie lately, this is the school therapist, the guidance counselor, played by Lisa Kudrow, and she's having a relationship with a boy who is, I think, a senior in high school for the fourth time. So he is 22 years old, and they're trying to figure out why he got chlamydia, and he, in fact, got chlamydia from the guidance counselor. And so you don't end up thinking that the guidance counselor is some champion character, but you're right. There just isn't this sort of condemnation that we would expect to see if the gender roles were reversed in that dynamic.
Right.
Especially with her being the therapist, right? That sort of adds an extra layer of inappropriateness.
There's a lot of power differences there. A lot going on.
Oh, but there is one good line that comes out of all that chlamydia talk, right? One of my favorite lines in the film that I wrote down was, "If there's one thing worse than chlamydia, it's Florida."
That is accurate. One of the things that I noticed in this movie that I was like, this isn't quite right, is that this feels like somebody's stereotype of youth hookup culture, in the sense that, again, as like the ruse gets going, it kind of seems like people are like having lots of sex and talking about their sexual exploits a lot, and nobody's in a relationship. Except for like a couple of the Christian kids. Like none of these people are in relationships at all. This sex isn't like even accidentally like causing some people to start relationships together. Yeah, right. So again, I this was a thing that I associate with the last decade, and is I will usually note as a misconception. I'm aware that hookup culture is a thing, and that commonly people feel pressure to resist developing feelings And yet, the data strongly suggests that when people are having a lot of sex with each other, feelings are caught and relationships form, and it's very hard to avoid that. So I thought it was just kind of odd that there's almost nothing to say about ongoing relationships with any of the teenage characters, really, and I just didn't know where the relationships went, where they went. They seemed to be gone.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody in the film either seems to be partaking in purity culture or in hookup culture, right? And that there is kind of like no middle ground between that.
Yes.
And, you know, that is something that I think this film and a lot of media gets wrong about adolescent and college sexuality, which is that there's sort of this assumption that everyone is out there hooking up all the time. And, you know, the reality is that college students, especially today, and adolescents, they're having less sex than generations past. Like, this is actually the most sexually inactive generation in a long time. They're waiting much longer to have sex. Many of them are reaching adulthood still as virgins. I should also mention, you know, the language around virginity is something that has also changed since this film has come out. Nowadays, we often talk about it as sexual debut instead of virginity, which I know is a term.
I do love that. It's like jazz hands.
Exactly.
Like, all right, everyone in the audience, please welcome Justin Lehmiller.
It's a fun term, but I don't always use it. Sometimes I use virginity just because, again, people are more likely to know what I'm talking about there. But yeah, you know, young adults today, like, they're just not having as much sex. And I don't think there's as much pressure on them to feel like they need to have sex as they did in the past. I think because we've got this delayed adulthood happening in so many ways, and people are waiting longer, not just to have sex, but to enter relationships and to move out of their parents' home and so forth. You know, it's just for young people today, it's a totally different landscape when it comes to sex and relationships compared to what was happening around the time this film came out.
Yeah, good point. So this movie is trying to do a morally complex thing, to say the least. And so we should ask ourselves, are we okay with this? I do think this movie took a big swing. So what do we think? How did it land 14 years later?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways it's kind of quaint to watch this, right? Because it was really depicting kind of the beginnings of internet culture and how people started posting everything about their sex lives and relationships online. It was kind of prescient in that way, in that,
I agree,
you know,
totally.
People do very much document like what's happening in their dating and sex lives on the internet. And they do it in so many different ways, you know, from what people talk about on social media to what people are doing on OnlyFans, right? So yeah, people increasingly are sharing lots of aspects of their sex lives, their relationships online. And so, you know, the way that this movie did it, it was just like a very early take on it, right?
Yeah, I thought about that too. It does feel like the early days of we're sharing everything. And I do think the movie's saying something interesting about the distinction between like fame and infamy, and the distinction between like what gets to be private and what must be public. And I also find those themes really interesting to think about. And in some ways, maybe the movie doesn't have a clear point of view because these questions were really just arising at this time.
And there are also so many anachronisms in this film. Like Facebook was the only social media platform that young people use at the time, which definitely is not true today. You know, how this would play in the TikTok era would be a little bit different.
Yeah, a little different. Eli, what about you?
Okay, I had strong feelings about some things that I really didn't like about sort of the ethics that the movie conveys. And I think my major concern in this space probably is that I think it failed colossally in its efforts to be sex positive and edgy. I think basically it was the opposite. I think it was, if you're really paying attention, an exercise in slut shaming. So we've already talked about how Olive's mom, the reason why she said she had a lot of sex partners when she was young is she had low self-worth. And then there's another scene. This is with the guidance counselor, admittedly not a character we're supposed to love, but she's The scene is where Mrs. Griffith, the counselor, tells Olive that she is having this affair with this student and gave him chlamydia, and that he's trying to cover for the guidance counselor by saying Olive gave it to him, right? And Olive says, because she's kind and trying to do everything for everybody, she says, well, I could have chlamydia. I mean, I could have easily given it to Micah. I mean, the whole school knows I've been whoring around. And Mrs. Griffith says, no, you haven't, because a real whore can't admit it to herself, much less others. I believe that the filmmakers' underlying slut shaming is showing in these scenes. The scene between Olive and her mother, the scene between Olive and Mrs. Griffith. In the one scene, it's, well, why did I have sex with lots of people? I had low self-worth. And in this scene, it's, well, no, a real whore, like one who's really sleeping around rather than pretending to sleep around, can't even admit it to herself. And I kind of resent the movie for trying to make itself seem as if it's really sex positive. And the truth is, at the very end of the movie, the like really, the happy ending part of all of this, Olive says, like, you can't judge me anymore. But let's be honest, what she's doing. She's saying, I might lose my virginity to this boy that I love and am going to have a long-term committed relationship with, and it's none of your business. But what exactly is transgressive about that? Basically, what she's doing is exactly what everybody thinks she should be doing anyway, and nowhere in this movie is it deemed remotely acceptable or morally conscionable to have sex because you want to have casual sex. And so for me, I think this is like trying to be an update to the Scarlet Letter, but at least in the Scarlet Letter, the villains manifested as villains. You knew they were villains. Olive's mom is presented as this like completely wonderful person, and her message to her daughter is sleeping around is something that women only do if they have low self-worth.
That has me thinking about how just kind of like the meaning of the term sex positivity has changed a lot over time, right? And I think when Easy A first came out, that it was considered to be a sex positive film, and it was considered to be pretty edgy from that particular standpoint. But looking back on it through a 2024 lens, like I share a lot of the same thoughts with you, Eli, that I didn't see this as being very sex positive in a lot of ways. Like, for example, you can also talk about LGBTQ representation in this film and how, the only gay character needed to pay Olive to pretend like she had sex with him so that he could gain social acceptance, because it was so taboo to be out in high school at that particular point in time. And that's only like 15 or so years ago, but how things have changed so much today. I don't think, a young LGBTQ person would be as likely to, have that same sort of experience and pressure on them. I know it also varies a lot regionally, depending on where you live and social norms and so forth. But yeah, it's not super sex positive from an LGBTQ standpoint. Also, it's not super sex positive from like the way it depicts the students who are kind of involved in purity culture, right? They're portrayed as being kind of, wacky and not to be taken seriously. And I think when it comes to being sex positive, you need to be accepting of the fact that different people make different sexual choices. And some people choose not to be sexually active. Some people choose to. And one way is not necessarily right or wrong or better than the other. But, there's this tendency for a lot of people who are very sex positive to judge and shame and criticize the choices of others who just make different sexual choices than they do.
Wow. I have to say, I really appreciate that perspective. I think there's a lot. Sex positive is a left-coded term.
Yep.
And I think it's really easy for people who use the term to focus on, gay rights and women having a right to have casual sex and those sorts of things. And I don't know that I've heard anybody before now say, what's also sex positive? Devout Christians opting into purity culture. That is also sex positivity, because that is their choice and that those are the decisions they're making. That is a very inclusive way of thinking about sex positivity.
And I think we got to be inclusive in the way we think about this, because everyone's different when they come to sex, and everybody needs and would benefit from sex education. But if you're only, presenting it and speaking to one audience, you're totally missing out on so many more people who also need that information as well.
Can I get an amen?
I'll say this about the sex positivity of the movie, as I encoded it, and the part that I thought worked reasonably well from my perspective, and it was the movie's decision to make this mostly about other people's reactions to Olive, right? And that even if the adults are pretty cool with kids these days. Boy, can peers be vicious to each other. And I appreciated that clarity.
Oh, yeah.
While also totally acknowledging all the points that you both are making.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think the original source material did a great job with this too. I mean, it really, the Scarlet Letter is a brutal takedown of, moralizing hypocrites who are trying to control everybody. These like highly, for lack of a better term, highly moralizing, controlling social context. And so it's trying to do a takedown of that. My fear is that at the end, the message wasn't so much that we shouldn't slut shame, but rather we should only slut shame people who are really sluts. And I was unimpressed with that as a sex positive message.
Interesting.
And one more note about sex positivity, I mentioned that line, like, if there's one thing worse than chlamydia, it's Florida, which is a funny line, but it also perpetuates this idea that having an STI is the worst thing that can possibly happen to you.
Yeah.
And so that's another element of sex positivity, which is that, we shouldn't be shaming or stigmatizing people who have STIs, because that is ultimately what leads a lot of people to not go get tested and to not talk about these things with their partners. And so, that's just another thought that I had along the way.
Surely there is more than one state worse than having an STI. You're totally right.
Surely. Well, let's pull out some quotes here. I'll do the first one. I cannot explain why I love this quote so much, but this is right as Olive and Brandon have arrived at Melody Bostick's party.
I hope you don't mind, but we had a few pre-cocktail party cocktails. Like before the cocktail party with cocktails. Listen, here's the sitch. Melody Bostick. Brandon was just in the middle of telling me this really funny thing, which is really funny. And I was wondering if there's like a room where we could go, where he could finish telling me that thing that's funny. If you know what I mean.
You can use my room. Down the hall to the left.
And I don't know if it's just like Emma Stone is my hero, and but also I wish I could be this confident and walk into a party where I am not exactly the most popular person there. Go up to the person who's hosting the party and just ask for what I want. I appreciate everything Emma Stone is bringing in this scene. Other quotes that you all have.
I look, the quote that hasn't come up yet that I think is interesting is the one that gives a shout out to all of these movies, right? This is a movie that is, as we observed at the top, something like an Easter egg hunt for famous rom-coms, right? And so the line Olive says,
"Whatever happened to chivalry? Does it only exist in 80s movies? I want John Cusack holding a boombox outside my window. I want to ride off on a lawnmower with Patrick Dempsey. I want Jake from 16 Candles waiting outside the church for me. I want Judd Nelson thrusting his fist into the air because he knows he got me just once. I want my life to be like an 80s movie."
And I like this for a lot of reasons. First of all, I think it's fun just to have all those little memories as she's sort of listing them off. But the other reason is one of the themes that comes up a lot on Love Factually is what we do with grand romantic gestures. There's a lot of very romantic things, or at least we thought they were romantic at the time, that haven't really aged well. And so, Paul, one of the things that you and I have talked about and probably will continue to consider over time is, what does it look like to try to be seductive, to try to persuade somebody to be interested in you? And a lot of these scenes, scenes that she's checking off in her list of, best rom-coms here are scenes that have this sort of awkward grand romantic gesture problem where she says no, and so he goes bigger. And it's a little bit of a problem and sort of an interesting conundrum for our culture.
Another thing, too, with at least some of those scenes is that they don't even play in the movies quite the way we remember them. Maybe in an upcoming episode of Say Anything, we'll talk about the boombox scene, and it's not a happy, fun moment that reunites the lovers at all. So I think it's an interesting test case too of like what she's showing us is how those things lodged in our heads, people who came of age with those movies in particular, and how it's not quite what we remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, like so many things, it's sort of playing a game of telephone. There was a scene originally that, just sort of stuck with people. And then you have a lot of people who reference it and repeat it over and over and over. And then it just comes on to take a totally different meaning because it's devoid of its original context. But I think this idea that you need to have a big romantic grand gesture in order to demonstrate or prove your love for someone else is problematic in our culture because of just the enormous pressure and expectations that puts on people. And I think it leads so many people to engage in what I call performative dating, where they're dating for the camera or for what they're going to post on Instagram or social media for their audience, for their followers, as opposed to, doing something that's actually going to cultivate real human connection with another person.
I want to come back to the double standard for a second, because I think there's something really interesting that this movie raises that we don't quite know yet. So, let's just start with the, classic idea that men are more interested in casual sex than women, right? So if you go back like 3 decades, that's, an evolutionary psychological hypothesis, backed up by a number of studies, not just what people self-report, but also how they behave when they're approached by strangers on a street. Men are more into it than women. Mm-hmm. And, the original explanation was that this has evolved, okay? And then Terry Conley comes along, and Terry Conley says, we've got some other explanations too. For example, women are kind of freaked out when men do this, and also women make the assumption that these guys aren't very good in bed, right, relative to the opposite mixed gender pairing. But it did make me wonder, wait, how much of this also, some of women's reticence, is due to reputational concerns? Mm-hmm. And I actually couldn't find that's also this contributor to women's reluctance to have sex when propositioned, right? That sort of classic thing that we've been studying for decades and decades. So it's possible I missed something, but it wasn't in the great, Terry Conley 2011 study, and I'm not sure it's been done since, but I'd imagine that that's also a contributor, right? That even if the guy isn't a total creep show, and even if she does think that he might not be bad in bed, there's still like reputational things that might lead her to say no, even if she might otherwise be interested.
Yeah, and there certainly is truth to the idea that reputational concerns can be a factor that reduces women's interest in wanting to pursue casual sex. I have seen that come up in other research before. I can't think of the specific studies off the top of my head, but I know that finding is certainly out there in the literature. But I think there's something interesting too about how this is changing and shifting in the modern world, and also what are the reputational concerns for men today when it comes to their sexual history, and are men still accorded a greater status among their peers for being presumed to have had sex with more female partners, right? How is all of that changing? I think we need updated literature on this particular topic, just because the landscape is just so different for young adults today.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way you frame that at the end, I think is part of the story. It certainly will be interesting to know, like, guy has sex with girl, man has sex with woman, and then like hangs out with his dudes, and like, does he get the same sorts of high fives that he got in like 1980? But there's a broader way of thinking about this, which is, in the broader cultural context, how many forms of, sexual activity from men are admired and praised versus sort of held in contempt or worse. And I do think there has been a significant change leading up to the Me Too movement, and certainly after the Me Too movement, in the range of sexual behavior that men can engage in that is viewed as acceptable, and perhaps more to the point, the range of sexual behaviors men can engage in that are viewed as abhorrent. I think those are things that have shifted over time.
Yeah, right. Well, on this podcast, we rate movies from 1 to 5 stars. And I'll take this one first. I award Easy A 3 stars. I think this movie is a big swing, especially relative to most or even all teen comedies. In that it had a deeper message, that it cared about getting across, and it found the avatar in Emma Stone to be able to take a shot. And so I appreciate it for that reason, even though I agree that, sometimes that message got a little garbled in there. But Justin, let's toss it to you. How many stars do you give Easy A?
Yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle as well. As I was watching it, there are things that I really like about this film, and Emma Stone is so great in it. Yeah. And, it is still enjoyable to watch, but the same token, I was taking notes the entire movie, and I was like, oh, this scene, most uncomfortable in the movie. And then a few minutes later, I'm like, oh, nope, this is the most uncomfortable scene. Nope, this one is. And so there were just so many moments like that. And it's funny because I don't remember having that reaction the very first time I saw this movie when it came out. Like, I interpreted it and saw it through a totally different lens. So, back then, I think I probably would have been more in the, 4 or 5 star range, but I think I'm now at about 3 stars. Yeah.
All right. And Eli, what about you?
I end up where you guys are. Basically, I didn't love this movie, but I really am so grateful for any 90-minute excuse to be in Emma Stone's company. And so I also raised it up to a 3-star movie.
You did it.
She's amazing. She's amazing.
And it's so fast-paced. It's a really tightly told story.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's over before you know it. So I do appreciate a movie that gets the pacing right.
Absolutely. Now, on this podcast, we also rate these movies on Rust Bolts. Now, the Rust Bolt is named after Eli's advisor and Justin's grand advisor, the late, great Carol Rust Bolt, pioneer of close relationships research with 5 stars indicating a near-perfect depiction of the nature of close relationships. Eli, I'll toss it to you first. How many Rust Bolts do you award Easy A?
I gave it 2 Rust Bolts. It has interesting things to say, more stuff to say about like gossip and reputation than about relationships. Still, like the humor for Olive and Todd and Olive's parents and the microculture stuff. There's definitely some stuff in there. Not a whole lot. 2 Rust Bolts overall.
And Justin, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, my background is more in sexuality research. I started out as a relationship researcher and then got kind of sidetracked by sex. So, thinking about this more from thinking about this more from the sex research standpoint perspective, I'd say it's about 3 stars. There's lots that it does get right in terms of, at the particular point in time when it came out about the sexual double standard and slut shaming and, attitudes about virginity and so forth. But lots of things that, have not aged well or would be seen very differently today.
Yeah. And I think I also ended up at 3 Rust Bolts for this movie. I thought a lot of the things I wanted to say about the sexual double standard were helpful, were clarifying, were clear. But again, any movie that's going to skip established relationships really to any major degree, I'm going to knock it down for that a bit. So 3 Rust Bolts from me, and that is all the time that we have for our show today. We would like to thank Justin Lehmiller for joining us today. Justin, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this movie with us.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. And if your listeners want to learn more about me and my work, they can visit my website at sexandpsychology.com.
Highly recommend it.
Excellent. And Eli, I look forward to doing this with you next time.
I'm excited. The Love Factually podcast is produced and edited by Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, featuring music from Andrew Fraker and Sons. To learn more about the research discussed in this episode, check out our Substack. That's lovefactually.substack.com, where you can also subscribe to be notified when new episodes drop.